Hello, and welcome to Office Hour and Lecture for Economic 330, Global Trade and Political Economy, University of New York, Medgar Evers College. And I am Professor O. Felix Obi. Today, of course, is Tuesday, March 25th, 2025. A bit of a preamble today before we get into this week's lecture. And of course, afterwards, I will turn off the camera and we will get to office hour and your questions as necessary. I just want to be sure to remind the class again that in addition to your weekly assignment for the next 2 weeks, as you know, next week, Monday, school's closed. So the first day of class for next week would actually be on Tuesday. So as part of, in addition to your 2-week assessments, beginning from next week, Tuesday, you would also have your term paper. And on Friday evening, I would post a video and also an announcement detailing the requirements for the term paper. This term paper will be in lieu of a midterm. So just a few major points, right? Again, the term paper will become available by 12:01 a.m. Tuesday, April 1st, 2025. And I assure you, this is no April Fool's joke. Again, as you know, next week, Monday is not a school day, and the first school week will be on Tuesday, April 1st. The submission due date would be by 11:59 p.m. Friday, April 11th, 2025. I'm going to go over this so very briefly, and again, I would put up a posting detailing the directions for the paper and also, excuse me, and also it posted a direction for the paper and also a video walking you through the paper. But just very briefly, the term paper will be in addition, as I said, to your weekly assignments for the 2-week period ending April 11th. Here's a quick background on the term paper. It is going to be an integrative summary of 7 short papers or journal articles. These papers may be from academic literature or current news or international trade issues and political economy policies from anywhere in the world. So I'll say that again. Your term paper or project is an integrative summary of 7 short papers or journal articles. These papers may be from academic literature or current news on international trade issues and political economy policy from anywhere in the world. The term paper should be no longer than 10 pages. The term paper cannot be longer than 10 pages. Please note that there will be a penalty for not adhering to the page limit. You are required to summarize 7 journal articles or papers selected from the following topics: trade policy, economic analysis, economic historical analysis, trade conflicts, regional arrangements, international diplomacy, international political economy perspectives. It is important to identify a narrow topic. Kindly and please note that if you select a broad topic, such as global political economy, you will be penalized and heavily, including up to 30% of your grade. Every article that you select must be at least 3 pages long. Kindly note that if you select an article that is not at least 3 pages long, such an article will not count as one of your 7 articles. So layout and structure. The first page is the term of your term paper should be the title page, which includes your name, class, professor, semester, and date. The next page should be an integrative summary section that describes a common thread that runs between your 7 selected articles and identifies and describes lessons learned or conclusions. That's your thesis statement. The next 7 pages should be a summary of each of your 7 papers. And the summary for each of your 7 papers must not, the summary for each paper must not be more than 1 page, but must be at least 3/4 of a page. Now, after the 7 papers, you have a bibliography page, which will give the sources where I can find the 7 papers that you summarized, that you summarized. Again, I will go into this in a much more detail in a separate paper that I will, in a separate posting that I will make available Friday evening. But you would have up to the next 2 weeks, beginning Tuesday, to complete the assignment. So the important thing to note is that you're not actually, in theory, writing a 10-page paper, unlike how it might seem initially. What you will actually be doing is your first page is your cover page. The second page is your integrative summary, indicating the 7 papers you selected and why you selected them and the common theme that runs across them. So now you have 2 pages. The next 7 pages, each page will be a summary of one of the 7 papers. No summary can run more than 1 page long, nor less than 3/4 of a page in length. So by the time you add the 7 papers, plus your cover page and integrative summary, you have 7, 8, 9. The 10th page is your bibliography. And again, I would go through this in a separate post on Friday. So you need not worry so much about it, but I wanted you to have some time to digest it, kind of have ideas start rolling around in your head about how you want to attack the paper. Just keep it simple. Follow the rules, but keep it simple. Don't make it overly complicated. At least that's my advice. Some people might want to flex, and that's okay too. You want to flex and just really show out, I welcome that as well. So now that I've gotten that out of the way, let's quickly transition to this week's lecture. So between last week and this week, we would have covered international monetary relations, which we did last week, and this week, global trade relations. As we now begin to so remember, this is the second of a 3-part series, right? So the first series was on international monetary relations, and the second part is on global trade relations. Obviously, you need financing to finance trade. So there is a method to how this is structured. You have to have the capacity to engage in trade, which is what you call in economics, effective demand. Next to having the capacity to engage in trade, there now has to be norms that can ensure that, to the extent possible, international trade is a win-win proposition, right? So that is the logic that the class sequencing is following. So we will discuss theories of trade. In this class, of course, I will discuss theories of trade, the evolution of multilateral and bilateral trade arrangements. Special attention will also be given to regional trade agreements. So it's important that we begin to understand that distinction between global trade arrangement as previously envisioned by General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, which, as you know, then transitioned to the World Trade Organization. So that takes a global view on international trade. But there are also regional trade associations and regional economic blocs. For those of us who are from the United States, there is, of course, the USMCA that used to be NAFTA. It used to be North American Free Trade Agreement. It transitioned into the US, Mexico, and Canada Trade Agreement, Free Trade Agreement. And that is, of course, is a trade bloc for the Americas from Mexico in the southern tip of North American continent to the United States and Canada. Of course, that trade agreement is now a little bit under pressure given the placement of tariffs and counter tariffs, but that gives you an idea what a regional trade agreement is. Of course, on the Caribbean, there is CARICOM, which is the regional trade agreement for the Caribbean. In Asia, there is, for instance, Southeast Asian Economic Arrangement, which is called ASEAN. In Africa, there is AFTA, African Continental Free Trade Agreement. There is also MECORSA, I think it's called, in South America. So these are regional trade agreements that can augment. One theory is that they augment the global international trading system. There is a counter narrative that it balkanizes the trading systems, and as such, is not very helpful. Again, this goes back to the concept that I mentioned several classes ago, that to understand global trade and political economy, you have to employ a little bit of dialectical thinking, which is understanding the issue from all sides and understanding that sometimes there is no clear-cut good or bad, but you can say on balance that such approach is more helpful or more beneficial because of. So special attention will be given to regional trade agreements, as I mentioned, as we discuss global trade relations. Finally, we will discuss trade regimes and how they affect relations between nations and groups. Right? That is an issue that is helpful that we also touch on. Trade can be a contentious issue, as again, I've said that perhaps isn't a better time in history than now to be a student in global trade and political economy, because the entire world is literally a laboratory for some of the topics that we cover in class, or at least perhaps even many of the topics we cover in class. So trade can be a contentious issue because interest groups and the broader public view their welfare as being more affected by trade policy than by monetary policy, investment, or financial policy. Thus, business, labor, agriculture, consumer, environmental, and cultural groups try to influence government trade policies. The forces of globalization also continue to have a major effect on trade relations. So, and this is really important to note. So there is a domestic constituency that seeks to exert influence on global trade policy. And there is, of course, also an international constituency that tries to affect or influence global trade relations. So these are, and there can be oftentimes tension between these two distinct groups. But the outcome of one group successfully advocating for a position can sometimes and could quite often influence and affect the other. And we will unpack that a little bit. So business, labor, agricultural, consumer, environmental, and cultural groups, they all try to influence government trade policy. the forces of globalization also have a major effect on trade relations. Consider that from 1950 to 1973, all right, world economic output, or GDP, grew at an average annual rate of 5.1%, while trade increased on average by 8.2%. However, from 1974 to 2007, the figures were 2.9% for GDP and 5.0% for trade growth. The growing interdependence of states has also made trade relations more vulnerable to economic downturns. Thus, the 2008 global financial crisis precipitated drops in global production and trade, first in the developed economies and then in developed countries. Recall that in a previous class some weeks ago, I introduced the phrase economic contagion. More recently, last week's lecture included why, in effort to promote their exports, many countries engage in the competitive undervaluation of their currencies. As you will recall, my lecture included the definition, advantages, and disadvantages of fixed exchange rates, also known as the gold standard, floating exchange rates, pegged exchange rate systems, which incorporate aspects of floating and fixed exchange rate systems. We also discussed how exchange rate regimes can affect the balance of payments of countries. It should be noted, however, that the practice of adopting non-market measures to manipulate currency valuation can raise the possibility of a trade war. Indeed, your reading assignment for this week includes tariffs and counter-tariffs between US and Chinese governments, especially during President Trump's first administration. Furthermore, note that trade and foreign investment are closely related, and multinational corporations have considerable influence on trade issues, and intra-firm trade within multinational corporations account for about a third of total world trade. As we continue with this second of the three segments that began in Module 8, we will discuss theories of trade, the evolution of multilateral and bilateral trade arrangements. Just very quickly, and just to quickly recap, multilateral trade arrangements are trade arrangements that has to do with more than two countries. Bilateral trade agreements are agreements that deal with just two countries. So, special attention will be given to regional trade agreements, as I said. Finally, we will discuss trade regimes and how they affect relations between nations and groups within a country. So, the learning objectives for this week. And here are some of the things that you ought to be able to know and master at the conclusion of this week. 1, explain multilateral trade relations during the last 2 centuries. So, from the Silk Road to today's Belt and Road Initiative, from North American Free Trade Agreement NAFTA to the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, from the creation of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, and to the birth of the WTO, which is the World Trade Organization, trade has played an important role in supporting economic development, promoting peaceful relations among nations. 2, describe the evolution of international trade organizations such as the GATT, WTO, and regional trade associations. Here's one description. Consider that as we discussed in previous lectures, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, evolved into the World Trade Organization to include trade in services and intellectual property protection. While regional trade associations such as the USMCA, ASEAN, the European Union has forged free trade zones to common markets that create economic interdependencies, and as a result, disincentivizes conflict. Again, the general sentiment is that as countries get interconnected, countries' economies get interconnected through trade and economic interdependencies, that these countries have an incentive not to go into war or conflict. Doesn't always work, but for the most part, it does. The third learning objective for the week is to explain why trade among nations is potentially advantageous to all trading partners. One way to explain this would be to say that all things being equal, trade among nations is advantageous to all trading partners because leveraging the comparative advantages of each country enhances the efficiency of global supply chains. So at each section of the global supply chain, a country or region has a comparative advantage, which means they are the ones who can most efficiently bring their goods or services to market, all things being equal, and therefore adding an efficiency chain in the global supply chain. This allows countries to grow their economy through the sale of goods and services where it has comparative advantage, while still being able to enjoy the goods it imports from trading partner countries with comparative advantages in the imported goods and/or services. Let me quickly add that the technical terminologies for this class include absolute advantage, comparative advantage, and opportunity cost. We'll unpack this. Let me also remind you that our word of the week technical phrase and terminologies signal your technical subject matter knowledge to your audience. Now to the meaning of absolute advantage. It refers to the ability of a country or an entity to more efficiently produce a greater quantity of goods or services than the competition. The theory of absolute advantage dates back to Adam Smith, who you should know by now as an 18th century Scottish economist and philosopher who was a pioneer in the field of political economy. In Smith's seminal economics book, The Wealth of Nations, he theorized that countries should focus on goods they can produce efficiently and should use trade as a way to acquire things that they are not able to make themselves. The next phrase is comparative advantage, which refers to the ability of a country or an entity to produce goods and/or services at a lower opportunity cost compared to the competition, which leads to the next logical question. Well, what is an opportunity cost? Well, the opportunity cost refers to what you have to give up to buy what you want in terms of other goods or services. When economists use the word cost, we usually mean opportunity cost. So let me try to break that down in very simple terms. If you have $10 and you really want to go to the museum and also go to the movie. The problem is that both the museum and the movie each cost $10. So you, in reality, can either go to the movie or go to the museum because you only have $10. If you choose to go to the museum instead of the movie, then the cost of going to the movie is, or the opportunity cost of going to the movie is the price of the ticket, which is $10, plus for going to the museum. So if you choose to go to the movies and not the museum, the cost of going to the movies is $10 plus the opportunity cost, which is the museum, because that's what you had to give up in addition to paying $10. For government, it's very similar principle. Capital, money, is almost always a finite commodity. That means there is a fixed amount of it, and there is never unlimited source of money. Even for wealthy countries like the United States, that's why we have a budget. And that's why sometimes we have a budget deficit, as we now do in the United States. So a government might have $100 budget. Of course, no government has $100 budget, but this is just to illustrate the point. A government might have $100 budget, but it would like to provide free bus service for senior citizens, provide free kindergarten for children, and provide free healthcare for the low income. The problem is each of these programs will cost the government $50. So in reality, these programs will cost the government $150, but the government's overall budget is $100. Government can go borrow money, $50, to finance its budget, which is almost always a bad thing to do. Because if you ever have to borrow money, you want to borrow money in building your capacity to generate revenue rather than budget support, all things being equal. So going back to this example, the government now realizes that it cannot provide free bus service to senior citizens, free kindergarten for children, and free healthcare for the low income. So it must give up at least one of the three. If it chooses to give up free buses for senior citizens, then the cost of providing kindergarten care and healthcare is $100 plus giving up healthcare providers a service for senior citizens. So that's the opportunity cost. That's what you had to give up in addition to $100. So just remember that the world decides who you are by what you show it. That's why these phrases are important. They signal to your audience your technical grasp of the issue. And your audience will now decide how to place you, whether you have credibility or whether they think you're just talking noise. So, very critical advice. You don't get to tell the world how to think of you. The world gets to decide that by what you show it. So show them that you know the issue and you have a technical grasp. So, learning outcomes for this week. Upon the completion of this week, you will be able, or at least should be able to, one, distinguish the contrast between general agreement and tariffs in trade and WTO. Two, explain the role of North American trade agreements. Three, describe and explain the role of other regional trade agreements, such as the Association of Southeast Asian Countries, ASEAN, and the Caribbean Community, CARICOM. And four, describe and apply theories of trade, such as comparative advantage. But before I open the floor to questions or comments, let me congratulate the class for being well on our way to a successful completion of week 9, Global Trade Relations, the second of the 3 such segments that began in Module 8. And of course, getting ourselves ready for the term paper that in addition to your weekly assessments will come out next week, Tuesday. Again, as I said, Monday is a holiday. And with that, I'm going to end the recording and then take your questions as, hold on. Yes, I'm sure I want to